Abraham Lincoln Institute Symposium, hosted by Ford's Theater. My name is Jonathan White, and I'm chairman of the board of the Abraham Lincoln Institute. Normally, we meet at Ford's Theater every March to hear wonderful speakers talk about the life and legacy of our 16th president. This year, we had to cancel our annual symposium, but we are grateful to Ford's for offering to host a series of live webcasts with our speakers. I want to thank ALI President Ron Sudalter for making arrangements with our speakers, and the team at Ford's for making it all happen. In particular, I'd like to thank Paul Tatro, Erica Scott, Carolina Dulce, Gary Erskine, Juliana Avery, Colleen Pryor, Lauren B.A., and David McKenzie. Throughout the lecture, you can post questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Our speaker will address them at the end of the program. On Twitter, please use the hashtag FordsALI. Our speaker today is William Bartelt. Bill is a leading authority on Lincoln's Indiana years and is the author of There I Grew Up, Remembering Abraham Lincoln's Indiana Youth. He also serves on a number of Lincoln-related boards and is vice president of the Abraham Lincoln Association. Today, Bill will be speaking about his most recent book, Abe Lincoln's Youth, Shaping the Future President, which he co-edited with ALI board member Joshua Claiborne. It was published by the University of Indiana Press in 2019. One review calls Abe's Youth positively fascinating, while another says it offers a fascinating, in-depth examination of the future president. It is my pleasure to welcome Bill Bartelt.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Ford's Theater and the Abraham Lincoln Institute, for inviting me to be a part of this program. A little over 100 years ago, Southwest Indiana sculptor George Honig was studying in New York under a well-known sculptor by the name of Harmon McNeil. McNeil was working on a Lincoln statue at the time, and Honig told McNeil that he had grown up near where Abraham Lincoln grew up, in Indiana. Said one of the students of McNeil, "Nonsense. Of course, Lincoln and his family went through Indiana on their way to Illinois, but they weren't there for more than a few days." Well, today, as 100 years ago, that perception exists. Many do not know the Indiana Lincoln story. They don't know that he lived in Indiana from 1816 to 1830. From age 7 to age 21. Actually, a quarter of his life was spent in Indiana. Now, it's not a well-documented period. Most people rely on the work of William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, who came to Indiana in the fall of 1865 to see the site of Lincoln's youth and to talk to the people that knew Lincoln and to start correspondence that he would continue for a couple of years. Most biographers used his material, and they still use his material. But how do we interpret what little we know? Many authors view Lincoln's Indiana years as inconsequential. But my response to that is think in your own life. Think when you were 7 and think when you were 21 and how important those years were in shaping you and what you thought and what you are today. Now, to some, the Indiana years actually had a negative impact on Lincoln. William Herndon, in his 1888 book, Life of Lincoln, wrote, "Lincoln rose from a lower depth than most men, from a stagnant, putrid pool." Chauncey Black was a ghostwriter of Ward Hill Lemon's 1872 Lincoln biography, and Black wrote, "It is our duty to show the world the majesty and beauty of his character as it grew by itself and unassisted out of the unpromising soil. We must point mankind to the diamond glowing on the dunghill." Albert Beveridge, Indiana senator, wrote of Lincoln's neighbors that they were ignorant, rough-mannered, vividly superstitious, consumers of incredible quantities of whiskey and tobacco, and inclined to chewing, smoking, snuffing, and corncob pipes puffing. Their sense of modesty was embryonic, and they lived in cabins that were ill-kept, dirty in the extreme, infested with vermin, and their fighting and swearing were accompanied by low-thinking, repellent living, and filthy talk. Now, it might be the kind of people you'd like to go on a fishing trip with, but not necessarily the people you'd like to live next door to. And I don't think Lincoln lived next door to people like that either. Now, this view was enforced by other literature. Edward Eggleston, in his 1871 The Hoosier Schoolmaster book, associated Indiana with ignorance, poverty, hardship, and an odd dialect. I might go along with the odd dialect. In January of 1920, the Southwestern Indiana Historical Society was formed to improve the image of Lincoln's Hoosier years. It was formed by the residents of 8 of the most southwestern counties in Indiana, bounded by the Ohio River on the south and the Wabash River on the west. They hoped their work would improve the state's image by refuting myths and errors and challenging the "he grew up by himself unassisted" idea. Lincoln's Hoosier Roost formed the focal point of their work in what they call the Indiana Lincoln Inquiry. It excelled at contextualizing Lincoln in his Indiana environment. Now, by that time, the witnesses were dead, but there still were secondary sources and a lot of family stories that needed to be recorded. The Southwest Indiana Historical Society met 46 times, featured 369 presentations, and produced 217 papers until it came to an end in 1939. Now, not all of those were on Lincoln. Many of them were on Indiana history, but many of them were Lincoln, and my co-author, Josh Claiborne, and I have selected 30 of the important Lincoln Inquiry essays to be published in our book, Abe's Youth, Shaping the Future President. Now, this was not a typical historical society of the time. It was not just for descendants of pioneers. Many of the members were women. It was not just for men. As a matter of fact, 60% of the 533 members were women. Many of the officers were women, and many of the papers were presented by women. It has been called the most successful historical society in Indiana at the time. Now, much of the success was due to the founder, John E. Iglehart, an Evansville, Indiana railroad lawyer. He asserted dominant leadership, and he corresponded with Lincoln scholars, with William Barton, and with Ida Tarbell. There are 40 letters at the Indiana Historical Society between Iglehart and Tarbell. And Tarbell wrote him in one of these letters, "I do not believe that Lincoln can be understood without understanding better than I do, at least, Southwestern Indiana. What that country was, what its people thought and did, had, I'm convinced, a deep influence on the young Lincoln." Now, another person that Iglehart corresponded with, and there are some 30 letters here, was with Frederick Jackson Turner. Iglehart was taken by Turner's thesis, expressed in 1893, that the frontier shaped America's beliefs in individualism, political democracy, and economic mobility. And to Iglehart, Lincoln was the embodiment of the pioneer. Now, the society had several goals in its Lincoln Inquiry. Bess Urban, a Spencer County native where Lincoln lived, and the fourth president of the society, sums this up when she said, "Many writers have written books about Abraham Lincoln, his ancestry, childhood, manhood, and political career, but little thought has been given to the environment of his youth, or to those neighbors and boyhood friends of his in Indiana and the influence they undoubtedly had on his life and character." So one of the things they looked at was the neighbors. Lincoln and his neighbors shared common backgrounds. Most of them came to Kentucky by way of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina. And actually, most of them came to Indiana from the same area of Kentucky, and many of them knew each other and actually were kin in Kentucky. They came seeking opportunity to improve their life, and they were joined by relatives as the community developed. And in all these ways, the Lincolns were typical, just like their neighbors. Now, there was one exception to this, and that was a man by the name of William Jones. William Jones grew up in Vincennes, Indiana. His father was auditor of the Indiana Territory and secretary to William Henry Harrison, and saw the development of the Indiana Territory in the early 1800s. He came to Spencer County near the end of Lincoln's stay, and he had a little different political outlook than many of the people who lived in Indiana. As a matter of fact, Nathaniel Grigsby, Lincoln's good friend, said that Jones was Lincoln's guide and teacher in politics. And Dennis Hanks says Jones made Lincoln a Whig. Now, of course, there was no Whig party at that time, but I think what he's saying is Jones had the philosophy and the ideas that would become an important part of the Whig party a few years later. Now, another goal was to show that Lincoln's Indiana was a developing, changing, and dynamic region between 1816 and 1830. The conditions in 1830 were far different from the conditions in 1816 when the Lincolns came. In 1816, Indiana had about 63,000 people, and it only was settled in the southern third of the state. By 1830, it had over 343,000 and covered the southern two-thirds of the state. And most families, like the Lincolns, moved from primitive housing to more comfortable housing during that period of time. And communities developed. Soon there was a store, there were tanneries, mills, schools, and a church. And in the case of the Lincoln neighborhood, it was a Little Pigeon Primitive Baptist Church, which was built in 1822. Now, Lincoln lived in what we call the Little Pigeon Creek community. It was a 4 by 6 mile area. And in the 1820 census, we can document at least 130 people living in that area. And interestingly enough, 65% of them were under age 15. So Lincoln had people his own age to associate with. And it's also interesting to know that one of the important east-west roads ran on the southern boundary of the Lincoln farm. Kind of, well, not quite the center of the community, but near it. One direction on that road, less than 50 miles to the east, was the state capital of Indiana, Corydon, until 1825. A little more than 50 miles the other direction to the west was the town of New Harmony, the site of two communal societies. The first one was a religious society from 1814 to 1825, and they had been quite successful. By 1825, there were 800 people living in 180 substantial buildings. And then they sold out to Robert Owen, the Scottish industrialist who bought the land to make it a utopian society. Not successful, but New Harmony became the education center of the area. And Lincoln knew about this, and he talked about it. As far as we know, he never got to New Harmony, but he certainly would like to have visited there and talked to the people. The important thing about this, I think, is people going from New Harmony to Corydon or Corydon to New Harmony had to pass right by the Lincoln farm. And there's stories about Lincoln sitting on the rail fence and talking to the people as they came by, which his father didn't approve of. Bess Ehrman again sums up the inquiry's view of the neighbors when she said, "Here in this new free state, the boy Abraham Lincoln grew to young manhood. His neighbors were largely clear-minded, unpretending men of common sense, whose patriotism was unquestionable. He was undoubtedly molded by their influence." Now, another goal was to show that Southwestern Indiana had respected leaders to serve as role models. One of them was a man by the name of Daniel Grass, who lived in Rockport, the county seat of Spencer County. He came to Indiana in 1803. He was a veteran of the Battle of Tippecanoe. He was a member of the Indiana Constitutional Convention in 1816 and later was a state representative. Lincoln knew him well. As a matter of fact, Lincoln boarded with him for several weeks in 1828 while he was preparing to go on a flatboat trip. Another man was Ratliff Boone, who lived west of the Lincoln in the neighboring county of Warwick. Between 1816 and 1830, Boone was a state representative, a state senator, a lieutenant governor, was governor of Indiana for 3 months, and a U.S. congressman. And he would travel this road by the Lincoln farm, going from his home in Booneville to the Capitol in Corydon. They also tried to prove that Lincoln saw competent and educated lawyers. Now, we can't document the trials that Lincoln might have seen, partially because of the Spencer County courthouse burned. But we do know some of the lawyers that he was familiar with. One was John A. Brackenridge. Brackenridge was a leading pioneer lawyer in the area. He actually was educated at what is now Princeton University. He lived both in Rockport and Booneville. And in 1885, local history proclaimed Brackenridge was perhaps the ablest local attorney. Indeed, there were but few of his profession who equaled him in the state. His character was marked by strong individuality and fearless independence. He possessed a readiness of speech and a fund of resources that, combined with his quick perception, made him a strong and powerful advocate. Kind of sounds like Lincoln himself. And then there was Judge John Pritchard. He was admitted to the Connecticut bar before he came to Indiana. He served in Spencer County as a sheriff, judge, state representative, state senator, and we know that he lent books, law books, to Lincoln. Pritchard himself at one point said, "Abe wanted to read law with me, but his father was too poor to spare him away from the farm and the mill." So these men and others gave Lincoln his first exposure to government, politicians, and the law. Now, another misconception is that Lincoln's portrayed as living in an isolated region with little contact with neighbors and no interaction with the rest of the country. Maybe there's some truth to this in 1816, but again, not by most of the time that Lincoln lived in Indiana. Some 17 miles from Lincoln's home flowed the Ohio River. This interstate highway had a major impact on Lincoln and the area, of course. Lincoln talked about this in the White House when he told Secretary Seward that while working near the river, he took two travelers out to a passing river steamer. Each man threw a silver $50 on the bottom of Lincoln's little boat. And Lincoln said, "I could scarcely believe my eyes. You may think it's a very little thing, but it was a most important incident in my life. I could scarcely believe that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. The world seemed wider and fairer before me. I was a more hopeful and confident being from that time." Now, Lincoln's work on the river also got him into some legal trouble. You know, the river belongs to Kentucky, and Kentucky would give monopolies to people to operate ferries. In this area, it was the Dill brothers had the monopoly. And Lincoln, by taking people out to the steamers, violated that monopoly, at least in the Dill brothers' view. So they took Lincoln to the Kentucky Justice of the Peace, Squire Hall. And one account says that Lincoln argued his case, saying that he had not violated the monopoly to take people across the river because he only took them halfway. So it was not a violation. Well, we don't know if that's exactly what happened, but whatever he said, Squire Pate dismissed the charges. Now, the river separated old America from new America. Lincoln said they came to Indiana partly on account of slavery, and slavery was illegal in Indiana, but chiefly on account of the difficulty in land titles in Kentucky. In Indiana, there was a very systematic way of describing the land and claiming the land. So once you got a title to it, you knew it would be a clear title. The Ohio River was a source of income for Lincoln. He, Dennis Hanks, Squire Hall, cut firewood for fuel-hungry steamboats on the river. He worked for James Taylor at Troy in the river, probably in late 1825, early 1826. He did farm work, butchered hogs. He actually got $6 a month pay, but when he butchered hogs, he got an extra 31 cents a day. And he also operated a ferry across Anderson River where it flows into Ohio. And years later, Lincoln was remembered for his stories, which he entertained the Troy boys and also the people that he took across the river. And Lincoln would question them and learn what he could from the people that he ferried across that river. Now, Troy is is a site that doesn't get much attention, but I think it's an important site. The 1826 Indiana Gazetteer reported that Troy contained 19 families, 120 souls, one tavern, one store, two blacksmiths, a cabinet maker, two shoemakers, a physician, a tan-yard, a warehouse, and a post office. It always reminds me of where Lincoln will be living in less than 10 years at New Salem, Illinois. Lincoln's time at Troy was also an educational experience. He saw people traveling up and down the river, excuse me, and he saw newspapers from Pittsburgh to New Orleans. And the river introduced him to the emerging market economy. Farmers began to produce surplus, especially in Indiana. It was called hogs and hominy, pork and corn. There was a demand for Midwest produce in the South, and the cheapest transportation, of course, was a flatboat. Lincoln made a flatboat trip in 1828. Store owner James Gentry sent his son Allen Gentry, who was 21, and Lincoln, who was 19, to take his excess produce to New Orleans. Now think about it. This was a great responsibility for these two young men. They had to guide the flatboat around sandbars and tree snags and eddies and a river crowded with steamboats, and guard against ruthless river pirates. And they were attacked one night near Baton Rouge. Then they had to make the deals to sell the produce with some pretty astute negotiators. They sold to the plantations along the way. They sold remaining produce in New Orleans. They sold the boat for lumber. And now they had to protect Gentry's money in New Orleans and on the steamboat back. For a complete account of that, you might want to read Lincoln in New Orleans by Richard Campanella for a complete account of the 1821 trip and then the trip he also made in Illinois in 1831. The work of the Southwest Indiana Historical Society and its Lincoln Inquiry gives context to understanding Lincoln and his Indiana. There was criticism of the society. It was written by amateurs. It relied on family legends and traditions without documentation. It sought to advance preconceived notions about Lincoln and Southwestern Indiana, and they made errors. But with all its faults, the Society's work gives a more realistic view of the people and places Lincoln knew as a youth. For a complete, detailed account of the Lincoln, Indiana Inquiry, you can read Keith A. Erickson's 2012 book, Everybody's History, Indiana's Lincoln Inquiry and the Quest to Reclaim a President's Past, which documents the full story. Erickson concludes, to the Lincoln Inquiry, the quest to reclaim the 16th president combined national history, Western history, state history, local history, family history, public history, human history, in short, everybody's history.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was just wonderful. And the reviews I found that talked about your book as fascinating are absolutely correct. I highly recommend it to our viewers.
Thank you.
I actually would like to take the first question myself, and that is, so statues have been in the news a lot recently, including the Lincoln statue in Lincoln Park in DC. And last night I decided to go on eBay and look for Lincoln statues. I wanted to buy one for myself. And I, this morning, purchased a small model of the Lincoln Youth that, if memory serves correct, is in Fort Wayne outside of the Lincoln Financial Building. Could you tell the viewers a little bit about that statue of Lincoln? I don't think it's as widely known as some of the other ones, but it's there in Indiana depicting his time there.
Yeah, it's a manship statue, and it contains all the elements that almost always are associated with Indiana. It has a book, it has the axe, and this one also has a very happy dog. So those are the things that kind of we associate with Indiana. The Lincoln's quest for knowledge and his interest in reading, but also it was a lot of hard work, and the axe is always there. It's a very fine statue.
Yeah. Do you recall when it was installed? Was it the 1970s?
No. It was like the 1930s. I
Oh, it's
think.
earlier. Okay.
It's been there for quite some time. It was the Lincoln National Life Foundation, or Lincoln National Life Insurance was headquartered there, and
Right.
it was put up in front of their headquarters building.
Great. Well, that segues into a question we got from a viewer, and the person asked if you could talk about how Lincoln became such a brilliant writer with such minimal formal education.
Well, I guess today we'd call him gifted.
Yeah.
Lincoln, while in Indiana, he realized that he could craft words, both spoken and written. And of course, the way he educated himself was by reading. He didn't have very many books, but the books he had, he read and reread. You know, we don't think of that today, but if you don't have very many books, you're going to read the same ones over and over. And of course, one important one was the Bible. And you always see that the impact of his style of speaking from the Bible. And there were others. I recently picked up, I don't know if I had read it before or not, was Aesop's Fables. And I can really see why he would love that. That was one of them he read in Indiana, and those stories he would like that had, had the moral to them. And his stories had some reason for being told usually. He also understood, though, I think in Indiana, that words can hurt, and he had to be careful. There's a story of when he was not invited to a neighbor's wedding, and he wrote a satire called The Chronicles of Reuben, written in biblical style. That was really pretty biting, and I think he learned something from that. That was
about his brother-in-law, correct?
It was about the brother-in-law's family. Yes, and part of it was, his sister had died by that time, Sarah, who married Aaron Grigsby. And he felt that the Grigsbys, I think the words, let her lay too long. Right. She died in childbirth. And so there was some bad feeling between the Grigsbys and the Lincolns. And that's one reason why the Lincolns were not invited to the wedding dinner. And so he wrote this story. I always think it's kind of interesting that when Herndon came to Indiana, he asked about that. And one of the neighbors, Mrs. Crawford, said, well, it's a little smutty. And so I will tell my daughter-in-law the story, and she will tell her husband, and then her husband can tell you. Kind of the Victorian idea of what was proper to talk about.
That's right. Interesting. Another person asked, and you mentioned some of these in your talk, but another viewer asked if you can recommend recent books on Lincoln's youth, or I suppose any books, old or new, that you would recommend for people wanting to get an in-depth look at his youth in Indiana.
Yeah, well, the Bible is Lewis Warren's 1959 book called Lincoln's Youth. Warren was one of the first people who really did an in-depth study of the documents. Ida Tarbell did some of this, but Warren really did the study and tried to find all the documentation to go along with the stories. It's still a very valuable book. I found a couple things that I disagree with Warren, but very few things. So Lewis Warren's book is a very good one. My other book, There I Grew Up, took a little different approach. And for that one, I looked to see what did Lincoln say about his years in Indiana in his autobiographical statements. And then I tried to annotate that. And what did the family say? Because his stepmother was interviewed by Herndon and stepsister. And then what did the neighbors say? Particularly those Herndon documents, what did they say about Lincoln's time in Indiana? So that book is kind of Lincoln's history in Indiana by those who were there.
Right, that's right. You mentioned in your talk about the misconception that's out there that's, I think, widely told about how Lincoln's in this very isolated region. And you say that's probably true in 1816 when they first moved there, but then he is surrounded by more communities, neighbors. You mentioned even a number of people under 15 were in his area.
Yes.
How do you think that misconception, why do you think that misconception is so strong or so popular and so widely held?
Well, there were people there when Lincoln's moved in, and actually There was a man by the name of Carter that Lincoln knew in Kentucky, which is probably one of the reasons why he settled there. I think, again, it goes back to that diamond on a dunghill idea that you had to make it. Now, it was primitive. There's no question about that. They lived for a while in that three-sided camp, and they had to cut their way there, and they had to develop the farm. It was not very easy. But I think by making life even more difficult and more isolated than maybe it was, we see how far the man Abraham Lincoln came, unassisted, without any help.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, that ties into a good question, another question we got from a viewer, which is, how did Lincoln's relationship with his father shape the path he took as a young adult?
Well, that's interesting, because we always hear that, and you're not going to find any discussion of that in our book, because 100 years ago, the question was Lincoln's father, Thomas, a ne'er-do-well and shiftless? And so if there's any discussion at that time, they're trying to prove that Thomas Lincoln was pretty much a typical person, and he had great skills as a carpenter. And at least in Indiana, he was a very important member of the community. More recently, as I think it was the late John Y. Simon said, it's not important who Thomas Lincoln was, it's what his son thought about him. And that's a much harder question to answer. You have to understand that these two men, Thomas and Abraham, had very different views of the world. Thomas grew up in a hard situation. He saw his father killed when he was 6 years old. His older brother inherited everything. He had to fight for everything he had, and he was pretty successful. And by the time he was in Indiana, he was fairly successful. And so he thought his son needed the kind of skills to prepare himself for that kind of life. Now, Abraham did not want that kind of life. Abraham did not like hard physical labor. He did it, and he tolerated it. But very early on, he was ambitious in Indiana. And very early on, it was obvious that Abraham did not want to prepare for a life like his father had. And had they not moved to Illinois, Abraham would not have been a Spencer County farmer. I don't know if he'd been president of the United States, but he would have been very possibly an Indiana lawyer, a business person, an Indiana politician. So I think you have to look that they had a very different view of the world. And Thomas was a strict disciplinarian, as most people were. Most fathers were. That's what fathers were supposed to be. So actually, I think Abraham was like a lot. I grew up within 10 miles of where Lincoln grew up on a farm. And I knew a lot of farm boys who decided very early on they did not want to be a farmer. Now, They worked on the farm, they did the hard work, but as soon as they could, they wanted a different kind of world. I don't really know what the relationship was. I don't think it was a close, affectionate relationship, but I think they tolerated each other. And certainly Lincoln grew farther from his family as he went on to Springfield and became a successful professional and a politician. Dennis Hank talks about this, but you never know if Dennis is talking about Lincoln and Thomas in Indiana or in Illinois. So it's one of the big questions now, but in my view, it's not an easy one to answer. And I have a much better image of Thomas Lincoln and his skills, at least in Indiana. I think he really deteriorates in Illinois. The other important thing is, I said that Thomas was trying to prepare Abraham for his life. Well, the person who accepted that was John D. Johnson, Thomas Lincoln's stepson. Right. And so John D. Johnson and Thomas became quite close, just as Sarah Lincoln, Lincoln's stepmother, I think, saw in Abraham what the potential was and what his interests were, and really worked to help Lincoln develop those things.
That's right. Yeah, I agree with that. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the movie The Better Angels, which is set in the Indiana, childhood years of Abraham Lincoln's life. I personally loved the movie. I know a lot of Lincoln scholars did not care for the
You're
film.
one way or the other. No,
That's
there's no
right.
middle
You feel
ground.
strongly one way or the other. Could you talk a little bit about how that captures Lincoln's youth in Indiana and what your thoughts of the film were?
Well, I guess I have to tell you that I met with the producers even before they started it, and their purpose was to talk about that period of time from the death of Nancy Hanks, Lincoln's mother, to the remarrying and then Sarah Lincoln. It really is a story of the impact of the two mothers on Lincoln. It is not necessarily factual. It's a mood document, and you begin to see the human aspect of it, how difficult life was after Nancy died for that little over a year, from October 1818 to December 1819, when Sarah, the sister, who was 2 years older than Abraham, had to try to kind of take care of the house. I think you don't go into this looking at it as a documentary, but rather as a mood, emotional type story. And I was in contact with them from time to time. I'm listed as a historical advisor, but they didn't always go by what I said.
That's what historical advisors to films always say.
Right. I'm right. As I recall in the credits, I'm right above the Wrangler in the credits. So I don't know what that means.
One person asked, what readings did Lincoln lean on for the development of his vocabulary? So you mentioned Aesop's Fables is one of the things he was reading, the Bible. What other things was he reading to develop that incredible vocabulary?
I don't know that he read a lot of Shakespeare, but I think he was exposed to Shakespeare. Crawford had a book called The Kentucky Preceptor, which was a collection of short readings and so forth that students could read and they could use for their school programs and the like. And actually, that actual book is at the Lilly Library at Indiana University. And there were Shakespeare quotes in there. There also were great speeches, especially speeches for funeral orations of Americans. And then there's another thing that Lincoln, while he lived in Indiana, developed, I think, a great appreciation for the United States and for its founders. And he says this, you can go to his trip to become president, when he stops at these towns and makes speeches. And at Trenton, he talks about reading Weems' Life of Washington and how he was inspired, and that there actually was something more than common that these men were struggling for. They were not just struggling for independence, but they were struggling for a much more important philosophy and ideals. And then he goes to Independence Hall, and he talks about reading the Declaration of Independence and how important that was, and how there never was a political sentiment that he had that didn't come from the Declaration of Independence. And probably he read that for the first time in Indiana. There was a neighbor, David Turnham, who was a justice of the peace, and he had a book called The Revised Laws of Indiana, 1824, which Lincoln borrowed. And it had the laws of Indiana, but it also had the Declaration of Independence in it, and I think the Constitution of Indiana and the Constitution of the United States. And you can see Lincoln reading that and thinking about it. And his stepmother talked about how he really pondered things. And Lincoln at one time supposedly said that his mind was like a piece of steel, very difficult to scratch anything in it. But once it got there, you couldn't rub it out. And I think he was thinking about these things, and he was developing. I don't want to overdo the Indiana period. Certainly, he learned a lot and shaped by by his time in Illinois. But I think some of the basic ideas and the basic character of Lincoln was shaped in Indiana.
That's right. Well, that's wonderful. And I thank you so much for joining us today. We're about out of time. I will say this. In recent months, I have enjoyed reading more about Lincoln's youth than I have about the presidential years. And so, again, I will commend to our viewers, Abe's Youth, which is edited by Bill Bartelt and Joshua Claiborne, who is also on the ALA and ALI boards. And so I really do commend these books to everyone at home. I want to again thank everyone at home for joining us today. We are very grateful to Bill and to Fords for hosting this wonderful event. And we will meet again in 2 weeks at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th to hear James Lundberg speak about his new book, Horace Greeley, Print, Politics, and the Failure of American Nationhood. Until then, please stay safe and please keep reading good books about Abraham Lincoln.